this female judge in South Africa says that rape is a part of black culture. So the woman's name was Mabel Jansen. She's saying, I still have to meet a black girl who was not raped at about 12. Now, so first of all, there's a couple things. First of all, what does black culture mean? Okay, there's no really such thing as black culture, because there's a lot of countries, or there's lots of black people around the world. If you specifically apply the term black people to sub-Saharan people of sub-Saharan African descent, there's a lot of black cultures all over Africa, different cultures all across Africa, in diaspora communities in Europe and North America, Caribbean, Latin America, and Brazil. Some people, sometimes they apply the term black to other dark-skinned people who are not of sub-Saharan or recent sub-Saharan African descent, like Australian Aborigines. So you have a lot of black culture, but this woman, since she's South African, I'm sure she's referring specifically to South Africa. So now if you talk about specifically about South Africa, if you go back and read the history of South Africa, there's a lot of, you see that the black people of South Africa their societies have been systematically destroyed since the 19th century by European colonists. And yes, sure, everybody needs to take personal responsibility for what they do, but I mean, these are the consequences that you see when you see just societies being destroyed completely, or communities being destroyed and families being destroyed and so on. This is what you see, and it's not just in South Africa, but if you go to other countries, not just black people, but anywhere you go and you see similar destruction, similar society, a destruction of societies of specific ethnic groups or whatever, specific groups in places. So you see it in Canada with Aboriginal people. In Canada, you look at the rates of suicide, drug abuse, incarceration among Aboriginal people in Canada. They're very high. Look at African Americans in the United States. Again, a similar phenomenon. High rates of incarceration and homicide and so on. Higher than the general population. High rates of poverty. And now you go to South Africa, and you see high rates of violence, homicide, sexual assault. But the strange thing about South Africa is that you look at the crime rates in South Africa, and then the violent crime rates, and you compare it to the other African countries. South Africa's homicide rates are much, much higher than the homicide rates of, say, Zimbabwe or Zambia. They're significantly higher, even though when you look at even if you look in pre-colonial times of Southern Africa, the people who lived in, say, Zimbabwe were not that different from the people that lived in South Africa. Some of the people were the same ethnicity. So you would think it's strange, but what happened is, if you want to know the cause of the reason for South Africa's extremely high homicide rates and extreme high rates of violence, the cause is basically historical and recent history. So it's the colonization, it's the apartheid policies, and people. I'm not just making excuses, but you look at the way the policies that they had. If you read the history, they had these systematic policies to deprive black people of economic self-sufficiency. to destroy black communities, destroy economic self-sufficiency. Their laws, I can't remember the names of the laws right now, but I could look it up. But they had laws in the early 20th century, for example. Black people could not own, to stop black people from owning land, so that they could not be farmers. They couldn't support their families or make money as commercial farmers, because they wanted black people to work in, black South Africans to work in mines for white people. They wanted them working as white employees. They had situations where they took all the children, all the women and children from certain ethnic groups and forced them to work, deported them or moved them away, forced them to be workers on white farms. So they did all kinds of really bad, destructive things to black communities. And then all the way, if you fast forward, you go to apartheid times, which is when they implemented the outright apartheid, was after the Second World War in the 1950s. So then you had the apartheid, you had all these rules. You had black people, they didn't let black people live legally in towns. So you had a lot of broken families in towns. You had migrant labor. So you had men would leave, young men would be separated from their families and everything. They'd be leaving their wives and kids back home in the countryside, going to cities, living in cities. You have cities with predominantly male populations, no women. So the whole situation of apartheid and the whole colonialism and apartheid created a lot of social problems. A lot of the social problems that you see in South Africa today can be traced back to that period of time. You had education. Black people, they didn't want black people to get good educations because they said that black people should only be working menial labor, uneducated jobs, or low, unskilled jobs, and the skilled jobs should be reserved for whites. So they made sure that black people had substandard education, and there was a thing called the Bantu Education Act, which made sure that black people's education system, or the education system for black South Africans, was subpar, substandard. So you have people who are, people denied proper education, and then later on, of course, that policy, a policy of not providing good education for black people to make them unskilled workers, so they could only be unskilled workers, that policy backfired in the late 20th century when you had more technology. So they didn't need as much unskilled labor, but they needed more skilled labor because there was more high-tech machinery, and they needed people to operate the machinery. So then they had to start employing educated black, skilled black workers, but they did not have as many of them. So you had this, and what happens is when you have an unskilled workforce, they're unproductive. So you have people who aren't. That's what happens. You have if you have uneducated people who are unskilled, they don't produce as much per person as, say, more skilled or more educated workers. So the apartheid policies gave South Africa an unproductive workforce, and the other problem is that now the people who are running South Africa today, the ANC, those are people who grew up in apartheid. They grew up with no education. They grew up in a period when the black people would only get substandard education, or they wouldn't even go to school at all. So you see, you had a guy like Nelson Mandela. He was an educated person. He was actually a lawyer, went to law school. But you had a lot of these other ANC people. These people have no education. They didn't go to school, or they went to school. They barely went to school, and they spent their time fighting apartheid. So they have the ANC credentials, but they don't have any education. And anyway, so That's one of the problems. And then people say that South Africa was everything went bad after apartheid ended, and but when you read about it, crime was really high in South Africa. They had a massive homicide rate in South Africa in the 1970s and the 1980s. But the reason maybe people didn't notice or didn't care about it was because the murders were all taking place in black communities or maybe colored communities, but they weren't the white people. The whole police department was only there to protect white people, and the police were also giving guns to black warlords who were allied with the government, and they were assassinating people, shooting people. So the government was actually, they were paying black people to kill each other. So the police were not protecting black people. They were contributing to the homicide rate. The police were part of the problem in apartheid South Africa. So I mean, you have to look at the homicide rate during apartheid, and it was very high. The only difference now, I think, is that the police today are less likely to protect white people. So now the white people in South Africa are more likely to be victims of crime as well. It's not just only the black people who are victims now, but that's what happened. So it's not like South Africa had no crime before apartheid ended, and all of a sudden after apartheid they had a lot of crime. And the interesting thing is, if you look at countries besides South Africa, like I said, a lot of other countries outside of South Africa, neighboring countries who are much poorer than South Africa, have much lower homicide rates. So you could compare the rates, and South Africa's homicide rates are much higher, and those are most likely for the reasons that I already listed, which are South Africa has it's the history of the colonial rulers systematically taking away black people's, systematically destroying, making policies that destroyed black society in South Africa, and apartheid, all that type of stuff. Like they did a lot of messed up things, social engineering, that completely messed up the black society of South Africa. So that's why you have so much violence now. So then you see rapes and murders and stuff. Well, that's what happens. I'm sure if you took a group of white people and subjected them to the same social engineering, and you get the same results. Get a bunch of white people committing rapes and murders all day. So that's what happens.